we are going to take a look at some different areas of the world as we discuss the West and the world. And what I want you to look as we look at each of these areas, I want you to look specifically for application from our prior videos in this chapter. We talked in the last video about different motivations that Westerners had for their dealings with the rest of the world. And so what I'd like you to do is, as we discuss each of the areas separately in the chapter, I'd like you to think about, do you see economic motivations, political motivations, military motivations? Do you see influence of missionaries? Do you see the desire for bases, military bases? What do you see in the various areas that we're discussing? These slideshows will have a little bit more text on them so that you can take good notes. I'll probably drop my face out of the narration a little bit so that you can see that text fully and get it down as we talk about each slide. And of course, you can pause them as necessary. I'm going to try to make these videos rather short and sweet, but packed full of information as we go. All right, so let's begin talking about the West and the world, specifically in China. All right, so first of all, in China, the Chinese had been successful in largely keeping the foreign population, the European population, relegated to an area that they called, that the Europeans called Canton. This area is called Guangzhou. It was an area that Western trade was allowed to come in and to flourish, but to go no farther. And so here you can see on the left in the picture a particular street that was a interior street in Canton, which had a lot of American, British, French, and other factories. Although the American influence here was quite small. The other Western European nations, dominated. So we'll talk about why that affected the U.S. in a bit. From the outside, you can see the port of Canton with the various European factories studding the boardwalk there, studying where it abuts the water, and you can see the great amount of commerce that would take place. And so the Chinese did allow for Western trade, but they had pretty much controlled this to one particular city, letting these people come in and out and letting it benefit China in the way that they thought it would work for them. And so up until the 1820s, this is kind of how things went. But in the 1820s, we started to see some change and a power shift. And a lot of that was due to a product called opium. So Britain had banned opium, and it was, of course, a drug that caused a lot of havoc in people's lives, a hallucinogen that allowed people to live a life of escapism, but also of poverty, of joblessness, and of really wreaking havoc and controlling people. And so the Chinese government was very interested in the Chinese people not making use of this. And in fact, they banned opium in the 1930s. But the British were looking for a place to sell this. This was easily grown and, by the way, legally grown in India, over which the British had a lot of influence in the 1820s and 30s. Even though it was not directly ruled by Britain yet, it was largely kept under control for the British by the British East India Company. And this opium that was grown there could be brought over to China and sold to the Chinese people. So this created a rift between the Chinese government, who wanted this to be done and wanted this opium gone, and the British traders, who could make a lot of money off this. And so the British decided that no matter what the Chinese said, they would try to continue the trade of opium and to expand it. And what happened as a result is that eventually the Chinese government did a crackdown. This was in 1839, where they actually seized the British opium supplies and destroyed them, thus not allowing it to be sold on the open markets in China. And this did not go over very well with the British traders. The merchants believed that they had been wrong, that their property had been destroyed and violated, and they, first of all, fled mainland China and the Canton area, and they went to Hong Kong. And from Hong Kong, they petitioned the British government, basically saying that their rights to trade, their rights as merchants had been violated, that their property had been destroyed. And they said, not only do we want this paid back for our losses, we also want to not be told by the Chinese where we're going to trade and where we aren't going to trade. We do not want to be restricted to Canton. We want to be able to move more freely throughout China as merchants and tradesmen. And so the British government eventually hearkened to these calls and sent some British troops. Now, these British troops didn't have to be sent all the way from Britain because there were British troops already working with the British East India Company in India. And so they could come over and they could take control of several Chinese port cities and flex their muscle a little bit and basically say to the Chinese, you're not going to treat our merchants this way. You're not going to treat their product this way. You're going to instead do what we say. Now, the Chinese government had petitioned Queen Victoria in a letter that is in your text. If you want to flip through and find that letter, it's an interesting letter to read about on the moral grounds that this should not go forward, that opium was a destructive product and it would be better for all nations if it didn't exist and wasn't sold to the people. But the Chinese were not in a position to defeat the Western power of Britain. And so they agreed to the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking forced China to, first of all, cede Hong Kong to the British. Of course, some of you may know that Hong Kong was for a very long time a British possession and was only given back to the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China, in the last 20 years, a little earlier than that. They also had to pay the Chinese a $100 billion indemnity for the destruction of the opium product. And the British also got their way in that more cities would be opened to foreign trade. And these opium wars didn't stop. This continued to be an issue again in 1856 and 1860. So when you hear the opium wars, we're talking about multiple decades of problems. This is a picture of the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, which, of course, the Chinese did under duress. They didn't have much of a choice since the British had a superior military and certainly a superior navy. And so the British wanted a place to export a product, and they wanted to do this in China. And when they couldn't do it legally, they flexed their muscle to do it through political means, through a treaty. So what happened is that China continued to struggle. And one of the reasons for the struggle is that the Chinese people began to struggle between two different groups vying for leadership. You had your traditional Chinese rulers, and then you had your new reform-minded rulers who really more desired China to turn into a more modern-day republic. And so these two groups were vying for power, vying for respect of the people. But the Sino-Japanese War that took place between China and Japan in 1894 was humiliating. The Chinese were defeated, and this showed that they were not equivalent to the Western powers and not equivalent to the rising power of the Japanese, which, by the way, had been heavily influenced by the West by that point and had taken on some Westernization. It was a modern Western nation by as late as 1894. And so this seemed like a really big victory for the reform-minded challengers. they used this opportunity to call for a republic. Sun Yat-sen, a Chinese reform leader, he had been educated by Christian missionaries on the island of Hawaii. And he called for a more free and a more democratic type republic for China. Of course, the traditionalists did not want this. And as a result, the traditionalists tried a crackdown on everything foreign. And when this crackdown came, it was the idea that these foreign people have brought with them a lot of problems to China, and we need to go back to the old ways. We call this time period the Boxer Rebellion. All foreigners, but especially Christian missionaries, were seen as people who were spreading problems, undermining the traditional rule of China, undermining traditional Chinese folklore and religion, telling the people that they needed to leave these ways and convert to Christianity. And this divided the Reformed Chinese versus the traditional Chinese. And also because of the killing of Christians and the expelling of Christian missionaries and foreigners in general, it brought the Western powers out on behalf of the reformers. After these wars, the traditional rulers were humiliated and the Western powers won out. And by 1912, China has a Western-style Republican government. This came at a great cost to all of the people of China, both the reform-minded and the traditional. But what we have is China joining modern Western-style nations by the time just prior to World War I. Now, this picture up here is rather important. You may have heard before about the spheres of influence. All right. So what are we talking about when we mean the spheres of influence? Well, once China became a modern nation, the Western powers felt that much was owed to them. They had helped in this war to defeat the traditional Chinese. They had sent their soldiers, they had sent military advisors, they had sent weapons, and they expected to be able to share in the wealth of China. And so China was, in a sense, carved up, and that's the picture that you see here in this political cartoon, into spheres of influence. You see each European power there has a knife, and they're slicing up the pie of China, and they're saying, this is what we will influence. This is what we will influence. This will be our area to dominate. And what literally happened is kind of like the old Canton style segregated trade areas. Each of the European nations were given certain spheres of influence that they could dominate. In other words, the trade there would belong to Britain or to Germany. Or to Italy. And the group that really doesn't get a whole lot of say about this are the Chinese. The Chinese reformers are happy to have Western power and Western money and investment and Western style thinkers in China, and they're willing to trade off on these spheres of influence. You're not going to see a whole lot about the U.S. in China, and that's because we don't really make strong inroads in China until we do the open door policy, which comes quite a bit later. The spheres of influence eventually goes away, and the U.S. feels strong enough in the Pacific to say, you know what, how about if we just have open trade in China and may the best country win? Let's not have these spheres of influence that divide up these sectors of trade. Let's just let people openly compete in what's called the open door policy. And instead of limiting ourselves, we'll just say that the strongest Western countries, and the Chinese included, can compete for business in China. And so the U.S. is going to be in a position to do that only because of the foothold that they're going to take in China. And we're going to move on and talk a little bit about China.